Welcome to the American Reformer Podcast, hosted by Josh Abatoy and Timon Klein. Our mission is to promote a vigorous Christian approach to the cultural challenges of our day, rooted in the rich tradition of Protestant social and political thought.
All right, welcome back, everyone, to the American Reformer Podcast. One of your usual hosts here, Timon Klein, Editor-in-Chief at American Reformer, and I'm joined by a guest today, which I think many of our listeners will be familiar with. His name's Jon Whitehead, friend of American Reformer, and if you're in SBC world, certainly you probably know who Jon is. But Jon, for those that don't know, why don't you briefly introduce yourself, and then we'll hop into the topic.
Sure. The short story is I'm a lawyer just outside Kansas City, Missouri. I live here with a wife and 5 kids. I've been in practice now 21 years. Left Harvard and was at a very big litigation firm and then kind of a mid-sized firm. And now I've been a solo practitioner for about 15, 20 years almost. Most of my practice involves churches and religious groups or religious people who've been harmed. So we have been on local cases and also had cases go to the United States Supreme Court. We represented Trinity Lutheran in the playground case, and also parents in Carson versus Maine, along with some other friends in another case involving government denying commonly available benefits to religious people. So that's the corner I practice on, and it's been a fun practice. SBC wise, I graduated from Southwest Baptist University, and then have had the privilege of doing work for various state conventions, and have worked with the National SBC, been a committee member there, and then a trustee at the ERLC. Just ended my term there, so yes, have been active in those areas.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I started thinking of other things we could talk about as we're talking about various cases, but we will stick with the planned topic, which is some people may have seen in the has been in the news, this issue that's come up involving the Trump administration, where a previously I won't say heavily enforced for sure, but something called the Johnson Amendment was in play. The Trump administration has taken action against it, which I think, as we were talking about beforehand, goes back to stuff Trump was wanting to do in 2015, 2016, right when he was coming into office. So for many, this is a good development, and for per usual, there's consternation over it, and then I'm sure there's good faith actors that just think it's bad. So break it down for us. What is this Johnson Amendment thing we're talking about, and then we'll move into what's just happened with the Trump.
So the Johnson Amendment is a 1954 amendment to the tax code that says the definition of a charity. So every charity under the tax code under federal law is a 501c3, and that includes churches. They've lumped churches along with other secular charities into that category of 501c3. And one of the rules that the Johnson Amendment created was that 501c3s cannot participate in or intervene in any political campaign on behalf of a candidate for public office. So that was the rule that was adopted in 1954. And as the name implies, the primary sponsor, the member that introduced it, was Lyndon Baines Johnson, who eventually became president. But at that point, he was in Congress. Some of you will have slogged through Robert Caro's legendary biography of Johnson in the Senate, Master of the Senate. But what was striking about the Johnson Amendment is that it caused almost no controversy. There was no study behind it. It was introduced on the floor. The entire congressional record is Lyndon Johnson's about one-sentence statement in support, but it passes overwhelmingly in 1954 that charities should not intervene in political or where there's a political candidate. And the question is, why? What caused that? As best historians can figure, Johnson was upset that there were some primary opponents, campaign opponents that were using charitable arms to campaign against him. Notably, H.L. Hunt apparently had a group, and there was maybe one other that caused some consternation, that in effect large billionaire donors were using charities as a political campaign, not for charitable work. So there seemed to be, though, at least amongst Congress, lots of agreement around this issue that just shouldn't be what charities do. But you end up passing the rule that is expansive to all 501c3s, not just what we might think of secular charities, not just the Red Cross, not just the United Way, but it very specifically says 501c3s, including churches, cannot endorse candidates for elective office. And so, for whatever reason, that was maybe the consensus in Christian America. This is Eisenhower administration era. And so there's a broad Protestant consensus. This is before John F. Kennedy runs for president. This is before civil rights movement. There was a broad consensus that given the conditions in America, churches wouldn't normally do this. And so we end up passing this law. But lots of experience afterwards begins to show, but sometimes there are reasons churches want to address political issues and political candidates. Even they might have concerns about a particular candidate, and as that I think that happened probably first on the left through the 60s, and then with the rise of the religious right and anti-abortion politics, the right as well starts saying, well, hey, there are some issues that we think are fundamental and are part of ministry and not of politics. So there's been growing dissatisfaction on both sides of the aisle about this rule. And that probably it leads to the fact the IRS rarely enforced this rule. It was very hard to find a case where the Johnson Amendment was litigated all the way through. There were increasing numbers of those. The handful had increased over the last decade. And as the churches in this lawsuit pointed out, that always seemed to be enforced. The number of enforcements seemed to rise against the right, not the left. So everyone could point to pastors that said things that were close to the line or went over the line. Very rarely did the IRS enforce this over the roughly 70 years that this interpretation was in place.
And what was insofar as it was ever litigated, I mean, what was the standard they were applying to the definition of what intervention or endorsement meant? I mean, because I seem to remember there being some arguments that are, let's say, especially a national election, certain issues might be readily identifiable with one candidate over the other, such that if you're, ostensibly only addressing abortion, everyone knows what you're kind of doing if you're saying only vote for pro-life candidates, so on and so forth. So, but try to, break down insofar as we have one, a standard of how this was even being applied.
So, I mean, the most famous case was, in fact, a church that took out a full-page ad in their local newspaper and said, we want you to vote for this Republican candidate. And I can't remember if it was for this candidate or just against the Clintons, but I think it was during the Clinton era. But it in effect, the church agreed it was an endorsement. So it wasn't really a close case. There was a closer case involving Gary Hamrick. And I don't know if he admitted out the gate that he did endorse or not, but it was during pulpit speech, and he'd engaged in other activities as well. So they were not. There was not a clear standard about the hard cases, right? Where it is a Sunday morning sermon and a pastor says, here's how I'm applying this and here's what we believe. You never got that clarity. You got the clarity of, well, okay, here's a church engaging in outside action, telling the community, here's our endorsement for this particular candidate. And so by the time it gets there, then the church, in essence, nobody really contested it was an endorsement. And it wasn't. It might have been a product of their beliefs, but it wasn't in the course of teaching during religious services. So we didn't get a good test, and really that the fuzziness of the test and what it applied to ended up really being a lot of the problem. Whether Sunday morning speech, it applied to that. Everyone could kind of find videos of presidential candidates at churches talking to bodies. And so there was always grumbling about, was that a Johnson Amendment violation or not? And typically they'd say, well, we invited the other party's candidate to come, but they didn't want to come on this particular Sunday. And this is the only Sunday we're letting this be done. So there was a little bit of gamesmanship about the issue. But really, kind of the broad message was, and certainly there were activist groups that were encouraging a broad interpretation, was that really any politics, like you said, if you're talking about political issues that could be identified with a candidate, and so that really would cross into legislative speech, not necessarily candidate speech. And so it really was the case that kind of the political, if you talk to most pastors, they would have it in their head. The rule is, well, we can't talk about politics. And that was never the statutory text. The text was politics involving a candidate. So the rule has never been that you couldn't talk about legislation affecting the community. But that seemed to be the rule. The safe harbor pastors had in their head was, well, we shouldn't talk about politics. And that means, for example, in Missouri, we had a constitutional amendment on putting a right to abortion in our state constitution. And even pastors that have known me for a long time were telling me that, well, they thought, well, we can't talk about this constitutional amendment from our pulpit, right? I said, no, that's not the rule. The rule is you can't talk about candidates, but this is a constitutional issue that has clear implications under Christian teaching. So no, you would be free to talk about that. But yeah, if you didn't have a lawyer on speed dial and couldn't ask those questions, and even though we tried to make this clear over the years, there was still a lot of confusion in pulpits. Well, what am I allowed to say and what am I not allowed to say?
And certainly you would see, liberal activist groups, insinuating that was the standard, or confirming, in so many ways for people that, yeah, that is the standard. You can't talk about politics. I guess can't talk about the Constitution at all, any of the amendments,
right.
Right. Not to mention them, so it was fed, that kind of misunderstanding was fed. And I think even by, people who might be conservative on the particular issue, like abortion, might have a proper viewpoint on the particular issue, they would still also frequently further this kind of expansive reading of the Johnson Amendment. Both, maybe you'd say they were doing it legally, but really in principle, so it was almost like, well, this may not be what the Johnson Amendment requires, but it establishes the right principle that pastors just should never do this, right? So there's all these kind of cultural aspects feeding and hanging on like this one statute, the statutory language as like the predicate for developing an entire kind of ethic for the pulpit. At least that's what it seemed like to me, over the past decade or so.
Yeah, no, it hung around long. I mean, 7 years is a long time for a rule to be in place. And so whether it was on the left and about once an election cycle, somebody would get a letter, some church would get a letter to say, we watched your Sunday sermon and it talked about something too close to the line, and so we're going to turn you into the IRS, whether that was the ACLU or Americans for Separation of Church and State. Somebody would send that letter telling pastors, threatening them with a broad interpretation. As you said, look, you're a pastor, hopefully because you believe in ultimate principles and you want those to be permanent and high. And as someone has said, you don't want to mix up the words of God with your own opinions. So there is kind of a natural reluctance to say, I want to focus on the permanent, not the temporal. And there's that standard. And so you did end up with the bad habit of some people justifying the Johnson Amendment, even though it's clearly a First Amendment issue, by saying, well, but we wouldn't do that anyways. We can get around it. Lots of folks said, well, we can get around it by talking about what the issues we want to talk about, and our folks will understand the implication. But I still think the principle should be you don't want government in that discussion, even though there are principles about how the church handles disagreements and what things merit separation and what things don't merit separation. you don't want the government putting its thumb on what pastors can say from their pulpits. So it really was a bizarre law given our history. The history of tax exemption has long been government stays out of religious matters, even pre-Christian, right? The Rosetta Stone, if the translation is talking about exempting priests from taxes.
Mm-hmm.
And then under our own tradition, there's Magna Carta, 1215, the church will be free in its liberties. And then you end up in 1954, during the height of civil religion, with this odd rule that has a adverse impact, especially on pulpits. And so it was the aberration, not the rule, but because it lasted 70 years, more than a given lifetime for some folks, pastors did develop this odd habit of talking about it and kind of a justification. Well, it doesn't impact us. We don't have to be concerned about it because we wouldn't necessarily need to do that. And at certain times and places that might be right, but I don't think that was ever the constitutional rule, certainly not the biblical rule. And so I think all in all, it's good to get rid of Caesar's hand on the pulpit and let biblical principles control, not political principles.
Yeah. Yeah, and those principles have to be applied from time to time, to real life examples. I mean, this is certainly something that, Thomas Jefferson complained, in the 1800 election about, I forget the guy's name, a Presbyterian pastor in New York, who just like railed against him every week to his people, and then the sermons would be published, and it was like, he called him an atheist and godless and all this stuff. It was a real problem. So Jefferson would have loved to have had this protection, at the time. But point being, let's say you're obviously Jefferson was less than orthodox, we shall say. It certainly should be the allowable for a pastor, to call a spade in that situation. And the fact that he's running for office, is this some kind of exemption from the authority of the pastorate? So it's like a reverse exemption. You're not allowed to talk about the moral implications or give a moral analysis of someone as soon as they go in and declare that they're running a campaign. Now they're exempt from your criticism or your discipline. So this is a total. I would agree with you. It's a totally improper incursion into the authority of the church, and it's completely backwards because it's coming in on the back of an exemption for the church, and it's saying now we're going to weaponize this exemption. To the whole point of the exemption is you don't get to do that. That's why the exemption's there. So it is bizarre in its own. And I seem to remember too in some of the history there was concerns about communist activity through charities and these kinds of things in the early mid 50s as well. So it's like obviously this was not constructed to target churches, as you said, at the time of the height of civil religion, as if this was some broad principle going to apply, but that was the effect of it, an externality of many such cases. But what has, so what's the Trump administration doing now with this? We sort of been talking.
So it has been a burr beneath the saddle, obviously, for religious groups for a long time. Alliance Defending Freedom had a pulpit freedom project where they tried to get pulpits to make endorsements, and they would send those sermons into the IRS and ask to be investigated just to get a clear First Amendment ruling on the principle, and they couldn't get it. They couldn't get investigated for their pulpit speech. So President Trump, in his first term, signed an executive order that directed the IRS to not enforce it in cases of pulpit speech, that the Johnson Amendment wouldn't be interpreted that way. But it wasn't binding. And obviously, the problem of ruling by the pen is the next president comes in and flips it back. And so, obviously, it wasn't a permanent solution. So the permanent solution that has arisen in recent days, 2 churches in Texas and 2 parachurch ministries, National Religious Broadcasters and Intercessors for America, filed a lawsuit in district court in Texas, directly challenging, saying we want to endorse a candidate, we want to speak from our pulpits about these issues, making the case that it had been enforced unfairly against the right and not the left. So making the case that it violated both the First Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause. And there was some litigation over that. It was filed before the Trump administration came into office. So there was some litigation with the prior administration. But at this point, after discovery, after briefing, the IRS under Billy Long and the churches have agreed to a consent decree. So this is a judgment everyone agrees to, but it is an order of the court. So it's at least two branches involved now. The executive branch and the courts agree that participation in a political campaign does not include your religious services, teaching in religious services, or the normal ways of distribution. So if you put your sermons up on Facebook or stream them live, going outside the Sunday service there doesn't matter. Those are still normal means of communications. That is not participation in a political campaign, and so therefore your pulpit speech won't be considered in assessing whether or not you continue to meet the definition of charity.
So it would still prohibit in any, if a church in any official capacity was sort of running other campaign operations or something like this, not the members in a private capacity, but in some way, if the churches were doing other stuff, running themselves like a super PAC or something, I guess.
Right. You're still going to have limits on outside activity. So, right, the church, the example of putting an ad in the newspaper, not communication to your members, there's probably still a question there. Mm-hmm. Can you put up signs on your property to communicate to others? Probably still a question there. You still have to function as a charity, right? Mm-hmm. So materially, your charity has to function towards the charitable purposes, not towards political purposes. And so if a substantial part of your organization is devoted to political purposes, it won't be a charity. And that was true for legislation too. If a substantial part of your operations were devoted to legislation, then the question was, should you be classified as a church or a charity, or are you doing something else? So you can't take a big slug at this point to endorse a candidate, right? Your pastor can't sell out his pulpit. Your church can't spend most of their time on legislative activities or political campaigns. But the content of your sermons and teaching to members and Bible studies and whatever materials you send out, that isn't going to get counted against the substantial part test. So there will still be some edge cases. But I think, frankly, 95% of the issue of the chilling effect has been in the pulpit. That's been what churches want to do occasionally when they see a clear moral issue between two candidates. I don't think most churches, I've had churches ask me, well, can we participate in this campaign or that campaign legislatively? And the rule has been, look, you probably can't spend more than 2 weeks out of the year full time on this matter. But no church has ever come close to that, right? Most churches can't spend 2 full weeks, all the staff focused on this issue. They're busy caring for kids and teaching kids and teaching adults and ministering to the poor in their community. They don't have time to do that if you're operating like a church. Mm-hmm. So I think this really does solve the issue for 95% of churches. This is what they were concerned about. This will alleviate the concern they have, and they're going to keep doing the church thing they've been doing.
Yeah. Is there any, so it's kind of, tax exemption, restrictions on the activity under that exemption, now exemption from those restrictions, at least in this particular case, is the path we followed. If the early history of sort of tax exemptions in America, it was primarily developed for churches, right? And then this is expanded over time because of tax classification, right? In the 501. So now you have to, because of that, so we could say this particular exemption for pulpits is a leaning back towards our American practice, early American practice, which is a good thing. But then, of course, because the classification remains the same, all 501c3s, is there now it seems like you'd have issues of line blurring in a different way, which is like, well, how do we, the courts don't like to do this, but like define, where do we define preaching and pulpits and churches, because they're all still designated the same as, the ACLU or whatever other nonprofit you have. So is that a potential issue at this point? That others are going to try to piggyback off this to engage in endorsements, and force the court then to say, well, what's a pulpit? What's a sermon? Do you get to define that? You're a court, so on and so forth.
Sure. I mean, certainly there have been attempts in the housing allowance. So there's a tax provision for ministers that tries to stay in fact, out of the church governance, and it ends up benefiting pastors incidentally. So the money you give to your preacher for a house, for example, if there's a good reason for that, there's a special benefit for ministers of the gospel. And they've interpreted that broadly. That includes all religions, their equivalent of a minister or a priest. And so secular groups have, on occasion, tried to get that exemption. And so there have been a couple of attempts, and usually that gets ruled out on standing. You're a third party, you don't have standing to ask for that. And so you probably have similar issues here. But no doubt there will be an attempt to say, hey, you've classified us under the same tax code. And does that mean there's the same reason for us being under the tax code? Mm-hmm. And I do think that will be a fundamental, continues to be a fundamental question. Certainly the idea of the 50s and the 60s has been, well, we are trading a tax exemption to churches, and therefore we have the right to ask more of them, right? Mm-hmm. If you get tax-free money, then we have the right to make these demands on your speech or your operations. And I do think at some point there will have to be the question answered, but our church is a sui generis category, right? Yeah. The reason for separation, the two clauses, the First Amendment clauses, religion clauses, is different than secular charity. Mm-hmm. And so, in my view, the tax exemption for churches principle predates the trade idea. It's not just because the churches are doing something that benefits the government incidentally by helping the poor. That's not why churches are tax exempt. Churches are tax exempt because they have separate divine authority, and the state has, in the Anglo common law tradition, has always recognized the church is independent of the state. Like I said, as far back as Magna Carta, the church asserts independence from the king. And that history was in America, right? The church asserts independence from the state, and the state has long recognized the church has independence from the state. And that's a totally different reason than why you might give a charitable exemption to a secular charity. They are relieving benefits of the poor. That is a government function. Maybe that's a good reason to grant them a tax exemption, but the church has a different history, a longer pedigree of being separate. So that confusion will continue to happen as long as churches and other charities are under 501c3. I think that remains a live issue. This decision, the Trump administration's guidance, all those are strong indications they respect the traditional reason for churches being exempt, and we'll just have to see what the next administration does.
Yeah, I think you raise a good point that churches should recognize and wrestle with, which is you've been reduced to just any other charity, and you could probably identify all kinds of cultural effects for this, social gospel stuff, whatever. That's in a way that's how everyone views you anyway. So no surprise the law does, but recognizing you've been reduced to like this sort of quid pro quo between the government. We've given you this benefit. What are you providing? Where's the charity? Where are the homeless? And lots of churches do these types of things, but recognizing that's the primary benefit you provide to society from the perspective of the government, rather than recognizing, as you were saying, in an older conceptionist would say, the main thing the church provides, which is intangible, but it's also essential to society for it to function. But it's also not something we create. It's something we recognize, right? Because its authority is divine, just as the authority of government is divine. These are not derivative. We haven't ceded or delegated authority to the church. Its authority is inherent. And so it's not really a question of whether we could have it or not have it. We just have to recognize it. And that's why we do this. It deserves certain leeway and benefits to perform its mission, which do benefit society, but it's not something that we can, you could never calculate it or quantify it in the way you could with a charity that's, passing out toothbrushes or something to people. So it makes sense to have that relationship, to construct it and define it in more business-like terms. We're basically, it's like having a private contractor for a particular government job.
Right.
So I think it's important for pastors to realize, like, this is what they think of you. This is how you've been reduced in your status.
Right. And the not universally, but the pastors that are often apologetic for the Johnson Amendment. Well, we wouldn't do this anyways. If you press, they often have the view, well, we're getting a special deal from the government somehow, right? We're not quite sure why we have the special deal, but they do view it as like they've got a special deal from the government. And so the government has a right to ask these things. And like I said, I think that's just a product of it's been more than one lifetime, but they've not engaged with the real reasons for tax exemption. And so once you give up your identity as the church doing something that only the church can do, and you do view yourself as kind of a bartering for favors from the government, then you're more likely to submit to those impositions. And so, the best way to stand strong against that is to understand the nature of the church and its relationship to government, as it's always been in history, not just since the 50s.
Well, especially with the tax code, the way it functions, because you have to register in this way, right? If you're a church, you have to do this. And, churches are not, we're not like the high medieval papacy where you're exempt from civil law. We think that's bad too, right? It's just authority there. But since you have to comply in this way, there's no opt out either, where a church could say, well, look, we'll just refuse the exemption. We'll just say no thanks because we don't like the strings attached. You're stuck with this, right? Which is very intrusive and presumptuous from the part of the government, because a tax exemption is their prerogative. They don't have to do that for churches. I think they should, and they should recognize churches having certain status in society. They don't have to, but then on the other hand, there's no opt out. So there's really, they forced your hand in this way.
Yeah, it is interesting. So the rule is actually churches don't have to register. The government presumes that if you're a church, you are in compliance as a charity. And so that has led to some confusion. I'll occasionally get somebody that asks me, well, I don't need to be a 501c3. And that's not the case. You are a 501c3 just by virtue of being a church. And so whether you register or not, but like you said, this just is the classification the government is working under. Without explicitly stating why these various groups are under the same chapter. And so certainly under, the First Amendment, I think it is the case that Congress and the government should, under our principles, be hands off. But yeah, there's no way to totally avoid that interaction. The government has to classify you as something and to identify who it has control over and who it doesn't.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about, so here's the new policy basically, and it's something that's more favorable. Maybe not a total solution, but it's definitely more favorable than it was before. Like with anything, there could be complications. But what about what have you seen in the general commentary on this? Especially online. That's where we get commentary now. On this, I've seen various takes. I mean, I think, a sort of, I remember like Russell Moore commentary from 2016 that's like, no, this is, the Johnson Amendment's a good thing because churches shouldn't do this, which is, he probably said something religious liberty afterwards, which is contradictory. But I've seen others, more measured statements now. They're like, well, this is good, but churches should still almost act as if the Johnson Amendment is in place, self-regulate in that way. What's your take on how it's been received, and any, what's your own position on this part?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it depends on what time and place you think you're in. And so if you think the parties generally represent too broadly Christian traditions, then you're more happy to stay quiet about that. Whereas others have said, no, this is unreservedly a good thing. I tend to think on on my Baptist principles, it is unreservedly a good thing when the pulpit police is disbanded, even if in a particular election I was not going to speak out. I think the biblical principles at play, it is a matter of prudence. You do want to be careful not to be careless with the things of God. That's hopefully why you're in the pastorate, is that you think there is an eternal biblical scriptural message that applies, and so you don't want to be careless and confuse people between the pastor's personal opinion and what God has said. Ultimately, you want to be clear what God has said and not confuse that. However, there are times and places in history, I think, where there are clear choices, clear moral issues at stake, represented by the two candidates or by the two parties or multiple parties, right? Some places don't have a two-party system, but the biblical principle has never been don't talk about candidates. The biblical principle is make sure Scripture has its high place. The things of God have their high place and aren't treated too commonly. So, look, if it's the dog catcher in your town, probably whether their religious beliefs, whether they're Methodist or Baptist or Catholic, even. Probably the most important thing is whether they can catch dogs. And so probably not a matter of church instruction or church discipline in that election. But certainly there have been candidates. I can think in Missouri at points, there is a clear difference between the pro-abortion candidate and the pro-life candidate. There's a clear difference between the candidate that supports, secreting away children into this child courts against their parents' wishes to transition them. Right. So there are clear cases, clear biblical principles, and sometimes candidates stand for those issues. Mm-hmm. So I think hopefully this does return us to using biblical language, using biblical principles to decide, not social principles, because look, in different times and places, there are going to be reasons to speak up. And I think this has affected the right and the left at various times, right? I think when Kennedy came on the scene, you suddenly have a Catholic running for the first time for highest office. Baptists were kind of agitated about that in some places. And so clearly they wanted to talk about the religious beliefs of a candidate. And sometimes that is going to matter, and why the government should be actively enforcing that rule. I think, there's no good reason under the First Amendment principles to do that. The left, certainly the civil rights movement, that was largely motivated by ministers. And so they, thought they had a good reason to speak about moral issues from the pulpit, and the government shouldn't be involved in telling them what to say. And so I think we will have a return, hopefully, to biblical principles. Now, I do think it'll be interesting. There's probably a continuum of response, right? There's the Baptists don't live by every word their preacher says necessarily. So there's some room in kind of a low church atmosphere that if the pastor says, "Here's how I'm voting," that may or may not impact you too much. So there's the example of the pastor saying, "Here's how I'm applying the principles, and I'm going to vote." Yeah. That's kind of one edge of the response. The far edge of the response would be, well, look, if you vote for this party, that's a matter of church discipline, and you're going to be, need to find a new church. That is a much stronger response. I think calls for much more care about not binding consciences with opinion versus biblical teaching. But that'll be something to work out. The church has a history of deciding internally, wrestling with issues, wrestling with potential divisions, trying to stay unified, but then ultimately deciding, here's the group of people with their conscience either tells them they can work together or they can't, and that's fine. I think about the conversation during COVID over masking and vaccines. You saw that full response. There were some preachers that said, "Here's how I feel about the vaccine," or "Here's how I feel about masks." but we're going to put it up for a church decision. Here's how this church is going to respond to vaccines, going to respond to masks. In hindsight, I think some folks made the wrong decision, right? In hindsight, we can say they pushed it too strongly or they were led around by the nose by the government. But we have a process by which churches come to those decisions. And imagine if the government had passed a rule that said, well, you can't talk about the vaccine, or you can't discourage people from taking the vaccine. There was no reason, even on a contentious issue, and as much as we hate to divide unnecessarily, if there are people with a conscience that require them to divide, there's no good reason for the government to put their thumb on those internal discussions. That should be a matter of believers and churches and pastors using biblical principles to decide what's required of me, what's required of our work together. It shouldn't be the government putting their thumb. Well, the IRS gave us a sideward glance, and because of the IRS glare, we're not going to do X, Y, or Z. That shouldn't be part of our church discourse.
Yeah. I mean, even I would say, I mean, you know this about me, John. I'm an unabashed establishmentarian. But even on this, so I always describe that as like, in principle, I think the magistrate can basically control for malpractice, just like any profession. So I would say, if pastor's teaching heresy, he gets, you can do something about that in my world. We obviously don't have that now, but on this seems to me to be a totally different rule and unacceptable in that way to set out certain topics or things that can't be preached on or talked about. In fact, I would say what the magistrate should be doing is demanding you preach the full counsel of God to everything, right? That's what a good magistrate would do. And if a pastor is not doing that for whatever reason, that's when he would be in trouble for being a bad pastor. So, I flip it the other way, but certainly on, in our situation with our conditions, and certainly given that most churches in America, I would imagine, are either Baptist or non-denominational, Baptist, de facto in their church government, probably, it seems perfectly reasonable to say, look, if your pastor does a sloppy job and he's just like, doing campaign speeches every week and you don't like that, you just, you obviously can just get rid of him. I mean, this can be handled much more smoothly internally by churches. And if someone's being an idiot about the way they talk about politics, the members or other elders can address that. I think it'll be taken care of much easier. And I don't think most pastors want to do that anyway. I think most pastors are good pastors. But they should certainly also, I mean, now that you say it too, I've never asked my pastor, like, how should I vote? Everyone already has their opinion. I've never availed myself of that advice. But certainly, they should be able to counsel in this way. I mean, if you had people come to them and say, I need you to walk me through like how to assess the situation, or maybe if you had a whole congregation do that. I mean, certainly that should be within their freedom to do that. That's could be in certain contexts, part of shepherding. So, I think it's a good thing. And I think it is a better recognition of the internal, rights of pastoring and of the church. And also hopefully, I'm hoping begins to lead us back to where the church is not just one among many on the a la carte of nonprofits, but actually has recognition throughout the legal system of a special and singularly special kind of status that it's doing something different, and it's more important than the people that are collecting shoes for homeless people. It just is. I mean, it's more essential. And you bringing up COVID reminds me of that. I mean, there was certain COVID regulations probably in every state, and it's certainly encouraged by the federal government, that treated the church as one among many businesses, clubs, all these things. And I think that woke a lot of pastors up of like, you are not considered, they said you're not essential and you don't do anything really that important. They just let you do it, because they think it's true.
Worse. You're worse than Walmart in your town. Yeah.
You're worse than Walmart. You're worse than strip clubs, like you're less important than liquor stores, whatever. So all this is sort of cascading in a way, I think. So it's nice. Pastors are thinking about this stuff more, at least anecdotally. That's what I hear from them. So I think this is a great sort of almost thought exercise that this issue is brought up that pastors should work through and think about. Yeah, I mean, what do we even say about ourselves to the rest of the world of where we fit in society and what we're supposed to be doing? And I think they should declare themselves essential as often as possible, and let everyone know this is what we are, and that's why we get special treatment. It's totally fair.
Right. Yeah, and like as you just said, viewing yourself as essential might mean taking hard positions. And I think as much as Baptists get labeled schismatics, look, maybe it is the case that there are certain issues in the world. I can certainly think of issues where I think I've been ahead of the pack, right? I've had a strong view about this, that, or the other issue before others, and it would affect the way I would cooperate with others. And so I have cut relationships, but then found those that I agree with on fundamental principles of biblical teaching that I think are important. And so, there will be a church for you. And it may be that there's a group of churches that holds opposite political beliefs of me, but they're united and they're building community together, and in some ways preserving that function of the church, even if you're wrong on this political issue or that political issue, and wrong on dividing about that issue. I think you should have the authority to form churches and communities without government interference, even to some extent when you're wrong on those issues. If you took the other view of COVID from me, if you took the other view of certain of these issues, and you formed your own splinter group church, that we wore masks, so we all took the vaccine, as wrong as I think that might have been at the time, and especially with hindsight, I don't think the government had any business telling you couldn't form your fundamental associations, couldn't decide what was material to your conscience or not. As a semi-abashed disestablishmentarianism, or disestablishmentarian, I just think the government shouldn't have that role. The Protestant tradition has been, we grant liberty in that area, lots of liberty in that area, and I think that's best for everyone involved.
Yeah, and I think at least, I mean, this is not to open another can of worms at the end here, but I think a lot of it, especially during COVID, was just it was the revelation of like how little they care. I mean, I think people can put up with a lot if they think that their leaders, their governors, and their White House, so on and so forth, are doing so with care and not limiting their influence as much as possible. And then also if they just don't lie about things, if it was the Black Death, and they had said, sorry, you need to close up for a bit, I think everyone would have been fine with that, especially if it was fairly applied. But it turns out it wasn't the Black Death. So, people are just like, well, you don't seem to care at all. It's not just that you made mistakes. I think people can be patient with that. But it was the unfairness of the application of supposedly generally applicable laws. And then also there's just zero interest in caring for the church whatsoever. That's, I think, what pushes people over the edge. So the people are waking up to that. And I hope that it is making pastors appropriately more assertive, both about their role, but then also speaking to social and political issues, as they should. And pastors in this country used to, occupy parallel status with your leaders, your civil or secular leaders, for this reason. And there was much more cooperation, even informally, right? And they did have, they did expect you to and listen to you, expect you to talk about, things happening in the world, and maybe even who's running for office. It's just the way it went,
Yeah, the subtle pressure to find tricks around the system, right? I can live with this rule because it doesn't impact me because I'm good with words, and I can let you know what I think without saying the magic word. That is a symptom of an institution in which people lose trust, right? Yeah. If they can't be forthright. And so many pastors have found themselves pressured by social pressure or government pressure to, in essence, become untrustworthy, to not speak forthrightly, to not have clear principles. I'm all for saying, here's what I strongly believe in, and here's how it affects cooperation, but I can cooperate in other ways to do good. That I can respect, that disagreement, but I think lots of folks don't respect the pastor who says, I'm not going to take a strong position or not let you know what I believe out of some misguided sense of civil religion or false unity. I hope this gives pastors the room to be forthright and to become trustworthy. Again, as you've said, the pastor has fallen off along with other institutions, and part of that has been succumbing to rules like the Johnson Amendment and not speaking forthrightly.
Yeah, well said, John, and thank you for coming on to talk about this. Again, it did make national news, but I don't know if everyone was paying attention or knows the implications. So thanks for laying it out for us and giving us good background and discussion on that. And thank you, audience, as always, for joining. Do go subscribe and so forth. And until next time, God bless.
You can find American Reformer on the internet at www.americanreformer.org or on x.com, formerly Twitter, at @AMReformer. Don't forget to like, rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast. Please consider supporting us today by making a tax-deductible donation through our secure online donation portal at AmericanReformer.org. That's AmericanReformer.org.